Welcome to our 7th Outback conversation. The topic today is Where to for the Outback. We're joined by Tyronne Garstone, Acting CEO at Kimberley Land Council, Liz Ritchie, CEO at Regional Australia Institute, and Dr. Mark Stafford-Smith, Honorary Fellow at CSIRO.
All right, hello again, everybody. Thanks for joining us again here today. This is the second last in the series of Outback Conversations. And as you know, throughout this series, we've been looking at COVID-19 and how it's impacted Outback Australia in various different ways. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're on today. In my case, that's the Turrbal people. And I would like to extend my respects to their elders past and present, and to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here for today's session. I'm Edwina, I'm from the Pew Charitable Trust, and I've been facilitating the sessions throughout this series. I'd like to introduce our topic today, which is Where to for the Outback. So for today's session, we'll really be reflecting on some of our previous conversations and digging into what's needed at the local and national level to ensure that the Outback can survive and thrive in a post-COVID world. So I'm joined today by three presenters. I've got Tyronne Garstone from the Kimberley Land Council, Liz Ritchie from Regional Australia Institute, and Mark Stafford-Smith, formerly of CSIRO. Tyronne is a Bardi man, a Broome local and founding member of Saltwater Country. He has extensive experience in Indigenous training, employment and economic development initiatives. Liz is the CEO of the Regional Australia Institute and has a strong passion for regional Australia and ensuring its regions remain strong, vibrant and prosperous economies with scale. And Mark has over 30 years experience in drylands systems ecology, drought policy, climate adaptation, regional development and environmental monitoring. He's based in Canberra and contributes to research on adaptation and sustainable development, and likes to use the skill sets that he developed in 25 years living in Alice Springs in his work. Before we kick off, just a recap on the process for these sessions. Our speakers will each share a short presentation about their experiences, and then we'll go over to a Q&A session at the end there. If you have questions, post them in the chat box and make sure that you direct them to all panelists and attendees by toggling at the bottom of the chat box there. Or you can send questions directly to me by using the Q&A function. Okay, I think that about covers all the housekeeping. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Liz Ritchie.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Edwina, and thank you to the other panelists. Thank you to the team at Outback Alliance for the invitation to be part of today's important conversation, and also to acknowledge the great work that the Outback Alliance has been doing also through holding these webinars and participating in this important dialogue. So thank you very much for inviting me. Today I'm going to cover some of RAI's latest work that some of you may have seen in our report called the Big Movers. It is a rather lengthy report, so 7 minutes to get through will be quite a test. However, I'm going to move quite quickly, so apologies for that. It is a little bit data heavy, but there is direct linkages to, I guess, outback policy and thinking and population thinking. So I hope you enjoy it. So we're just going to share my slide here. Great. So the first slide that we have, sorry, I'm just moving to that, is really talking about the changing nature of population here in Australia. And what we have here is, I guess, a framework with which we use here at the RAI to distill regional Australia at large, because it is such a diverse mix. So we think about it in 4 key pillars, one being regional cities, which is self-explanatory, connected lifestyle regions, which is connected regions to regional cities, and of course the 2 areas that are probably more relevant here today in today's discussion is the industry and the service hubs, which is more than 15,000 residents but further afield from metropolitan areas. And of course heartland, which is those smaller rural and remote areas that are central in today's discussion. We love to bust myths at the RAI, and so here is yet a very important myth about populations, that myth that populations are declining, and what our work clearly shows us is that they are not, and that is not the case. So across the board, keeping in mind that these numbers are from the last census period, 2011 to 2016, this population across all groups is growing. However, there are places that are losing residents, and many of these places, even though it's a small amount, are within that kind of remote, rural remote community. Here we have our latest report, which I just mentioned, the big movers, and what you can see here, I guess, really is the caption of the capitals, which is less relevant, but just to share with you for your knowledge that predominantly the movement away from capitals is seen largely in Sydney and Melbourne, and a small amount in Adelaide. I guess one of the headline figures that supports this work is that, in fact, 65,000 more people chose regions over our capital cities. And again, this is just really important data for us to have as regional policy makers and thinkers, to really understand how we can best impact and support our regions, whether they be rural, remote or outback. Here are some of the kind of headline numbers, and as I said, there's a lot of numbers, but what I just wanted to draw your attention to, because what I think is most relevant in today's discussion, is this movement between region to region. As you can see in this slide, we have just under 700,000 people moving from region to region. And I think what's really interesting about that for today's discussion is that it tells us that once people have chosen to live in regional Australia, that they're more inclined to, if they are going to make a move, that they're more inclined to move to another regional area. So again, this is really insightful information. And equally, a couple of other interesting findings within the report is that we are a restless nation, us Australians. We move at twice the rate of our OECD friends, which is a startling fact, or certainly I found it to be, and that we're more likely to stay within our state when we move. So again, this is really important findings as we think about population at large and population within our own jurisdictions, because we at the Institute work with each jurisdiction around the country. So where are people moving to? This map really highlights, you can see here, the bright blue and green demonstrates, I guess, the highest level of movement, and that's in the order of up from 18% to nearly 55%. This is in proportion of its population. And I guess what's important about this is that many of those highlighted areas in the blue and green actually captures the remote and outback footprint. So again, we won't have time to go into all the detail today, but at large you can see that the mobility both in and out of outback Australia is very much at play. Perhaps not surprisingly, there's less movement to, I guess, that centre of Australia where you can see the red, and that also is reflected in kind of middle western parts of New South Wales and Western Victoria into South Australia there. So some of these more challenging areas that are further afield that do require that much more nuanced or unique policy thinking. Some of the areas, local government areas, just for your interest to see from, again, a percentage of population movement is what we're showing here. You can see that there is a large number of mining LGAs captured here, and I guess what's important is that during that census period we were still in the mining boom, so that has certainly played a factor in these results. So it will be really interesting to see how these look come the end of the next census period. Then we move to millennials. In the report, we're really interested in millennials, as are many of our regional stakeholders, because they're seen as the demographic that can have, I guess, the greatest potential or contribution to regional communities. And so again, you know, the numbers of nearly 180,000 regional millennials moving to capital cities probably wasn't a great surprise to us, but what was a surprise and what has really captured the media's attention is this nearly 208,000 millennials who move from region to region. So again, it's really just dispelling that myth that millennials are chasing the bright lights only, and this is sort of starting to tell us something about their patterns, their behaviours, what they're thinking, their motivation, what's driving them. So here I wanted to just quickly reflect on this in the map. As we saw earlier, the shading of the green and blue is the greatest amount of percentage movement for millennials, and that has a nice footprint over of Outback. But if we move to the next slide, this is millennials moving from region to region, and here you can see just absolutely dominated millennial movement in Outback areas. So that really is starting to tell us quite a unique story about what they like. And I guess what they've been telling us in the research, and this comes through very much in the report, is that the reasons why they are moving at such a rate is that they're looking for a housing affordability. They see regions as an opportunity for career advancement and development, and that can happen much faster for them. And then of course there's this lifestyle and adventurous spirit that millennials are chasing, that we know that they feel as if they're getting a sense of that when they move to different more remote parts of Australia, taking up challenging and exciting work, but equally you know, enjoying a different way of living, particularly if they haven't lived in regional areas. So in closing, in summary, we at the Institute are using this work and building up towards a national campaign, which we think is really important to promote the opportunities that exist in regional Australia to both live, work and invest. So everything that we're doing is sort of pointing in that direction. When we're thinking about I guess attraction and retention, and I guess for today's audience around the Outback, it is really important that as decision makers, as local leaders, as policy thinkers, that you're really understanding who your audience is, and that's why I wanted to share these mobility patterns, because without understanding the different demographics that are interested in Outback Australia, we can't plan appropriately. So it is really important to understand you know, the age groups that are coming through. Of course, places are also competing for the same kinds of people, and this is a factor. So finding your niche and ensuring that you have your own unique appeal to survive and thrive is really important. Many towns have led campaigns around the country. We see this all the time, but many of them are the same, and they feature the same benefits, and they're not differentiating. They're not they're not highlighting their competitive advantages. So again, I would say, what is your niche when thinking about these communities? There's a lot to love about rural and remote Australia, and so there's a lot that is different to the rest of regional Australia as well. There's many opportunities to draw on there. And this is just a part of our a latest initiative where we've pulled together some of corporate Australia to create what we call Regional Australia Council 2031, and we're essentially working with big business to help use the experience of COVID, which has fast-tracked, I guess, the future of work, to ensure that we can actually start to harness employment opportunities regardless of where we live, and that location is no barrier when it comes to employment and when it comes to services and other elements that are critical to our well-being as well. So that's an initiative. There's more information on our website for viewers who are interested in that. And that's probably enough to close there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. Sounds like you've got a good lot of data there that would be keep us busy for days digging into.
Yes.
Okay, we are going to go over to Tyronne in Broome now to hear some of his thoughts. And Liz, I'm sure we'll come back to you shortly with some questions.
Bardi. So, as Edwin has mentioned, my name is Tyronne. I'm from the Kimberleys. I'm a Bardi man. My country is about 200 k's north of Broome. Today, I'd like to acknowledge the Yawuru people, the elders past and present, and also the emerging leaders coming through to manage this country. Look, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview really about what's transpired in the Kimberleys. We have over 190 different remote communities within the Kimberleys, how we managed the COVID period, some of the lessons learned, and then really have a look at some of the things that we need to try and address post-COVID. So a little bit of context really goes back to say that, currently, it's been 90 days before we've had a recorded case in the Kimberleys. We've had over 4,000 people tested now. Really at the height of when COVID came through the Kimberleys, the majority of the cases were coming from within, I suppose, people coming from outside of the region to come back and do specialist work. And so at one point in time, we had up to 18 cases around COVID going through from there. I mean, one of the biggest things that we were challenged with was that the communication strategy. The population of the Kimberleys for Indigenous people is around about 40 to 45%. And with a lot of these communities speaking, there's 30 different language groups within the Kimberleys. So trying to communicate effectively was quite challenging. And we were of the view that there wasn't enough Indigenous voices around the thinking around that strategy. So the Kimberley Land Council, along with a few of the Aboriginal medical services, formed what we were saying a Kimberley Aboriginal Task Force. And this task force started to really work with both all the government agencies, all the service providers, and trying to address really a range of different issues. And when we start to delve into a lot of the concerns that were raised in the Kimberleys, I think COVID really starts to highlight some of the shortages in and around infrastructure. One of the biggest things that we had to try and address with was funerals. So due to the restrictions of the gathering sizes, because like a lot of Indigenous people, when someone passes, we generally have to have sorry time, and it's a big gathering of people. So a lot of people were opting not to hold their funerals, waiting for the COVID period to pass, which meant that our mortuaries were actually starting to really fill up. And so concerns around having loved ones, the reality is in the Kimberleys, there's only 40 spaces within all the mortuaries across the Kimberleys. And these were getting to basically full occupancy. How do we manage that in that interim period? How do we drive that? And this was before we weren't having any deaths from COVID. So the concerns, how we manage that. Other issues about having returning juveniles from Banksia, so down south, the juvenile prison, coming back into those communities. The concerns that communities had that a lot of these youths were offenders, and whether they would adhere to the strict community sanctions that we're putting on to try and protect their elders, because the real concern was that during COVID was that our community, our way of living, doesn't really mean physical distancing isn't something that we adhere to very well. So I must at this point say well done to the Gowan government and also to the Commonwealth government around initiating both the biosecurity initiatives, because they played a huge factor in the Kimberleys and other remote areas in trying to ensure that COVID was kept outside of our regions. So we continue to work through those. Another big issue for us was food security. We had the message that was coming from the Commonwealth was to say that the safest place for Indigenous people was to go back to their homelands. So we had thousands of people going out from the towns, from Broome, Fitzroy Crossing, Halls Creek and Kununurra, back to all these smaller communities. And what this was doing was that it was actually putting pressure on a lot of those community stores that weren't actually quite ready. So one, we actually had the amount of food available, it was the quality of food, and also it was the pricing that was concerned. And I know there's going to be further work by the Commonwealth Government into an inquiry around food security in these remote areas. They were big issues that we started to have to address as well. Housing, again, was a huge issue. 3 years ago, the Commonwealth withdrew funding to the state, Western Australian state government. So really, in basically the Kimberleys, we haven't had any investment in remote communities around housing for over 3 years. And what we saw was this influx of people going back out to communities, and there was inadequate facilities available for those people. So we had really concerns around a secondary wave of health issues coming out because of the overcrowding. Trachoma, scabies, STIs, they were real concerns that we started to try and manage for when we were trying to work through that. And that was again because the lack of infrastructure was coming out of those particular areas. Alcohol restrictions was a big issue for us as well, trying to manage social cohesion when you have people who have a lot of anxiety in regards to what was going on, how do we manage that, managing the financial payments, so the benefits that were coming from government. People were getting access to a lot more money than what they normally have. They were accessing the super without really fully understanding, the implications around that. All these sort of additional things are sort of adding and I suppose complicating the social cohesion and the fabric of a lot of these communities. We were trying to address and work with government around strategies and policies around that. I mean, that's some of the more pressing issues. But then, I mean, if you take a step back and have a look at it, there were a lot of positives to come out of COVID as well. And we have a look at that and we start to say, well, what are those positives? And really, during that 8-9 week hiatus when we really were in, I suppose, the midst of COVID, crime rate across the Kimberleys was almost zero. I mean, we were meeting every day with the superintendent and catching up to find out, and there was literally no break-ins, no domestic violence. People were getting back, relating to their families. The actual foundation of family structures were basically being rejoined again. People were going back out on country, practicing their culture and practicing their heritage, understanding their heritage values. So they were real good positives that we started to see out of it. Telehealth was another one. So where we used to have a lot of people having to travel in from remote communities to see a doctor. We're now implementing technology that enables people to be treated via different platforms, which is a game changer for us and saves a lot of time. We're also seeing a number of different initiatives in around in regards to testing. I think the Aboriginal medical services in the Kimberleys needed to be applauded. They played a fantastic role in keeping in front of the game around what types of supplies, particularly around hand sanitizers, face masks, and also around the point of care testing machines as well, which enables people to be tested and then get a result within 45 minutes. And again, that reduced the anxiety in those communities, it reduced us having to travel and move people into towns where we have to test them and sort of hold them down for 3 to 5 days. better hygiene was another big positive that we really started to come out of that, was that people started to become aware about, you need to wash your hands, you need to keep your place tidy. Again, not a common practice in a lot of those remote communities, and not necessarily having the supplies to do that. So we saw that as a positive to come out of all the COVID stuff. So really, when you start to collate and have a bit of a trade-off between the concerns that were raised and the issues that we're facing, to see some of the benefits and see the collaboration that really starts to happen during a pandemic to do that, we start to reflect and say, where are some of the things that we need to consider and really try, how do we take it going forward? And the obvious one for us is really around infrastructure. The strategy that was put to the people in the Outback and in the remote was that the safest place for you was to return back to your homelands, go back to your country, go back to your communities. However, there wasn't the infrastructure to support that. So really, how do we start to lobby government to re-engage in that conversation around building infrastructure? And that's a real opportunity there. I think if done properly, we can both create jobs, create wealth, and create safe communities where people can go back, just in case we do have another pandemic coming forward again. Also, policy around financial payments, I think, needs to be really thought through. I fear that a lot of the payments that have gone through from government haven't really been worked through. I really do have some serious concerns around the penalties that a lot of Aboriginal, Indigenous people are going to have in regards to the tax implications around applying for the super, not understanding the forms that they're filling out and receiving the benefit as a cash and grab type mentality. So I think we need to be able to inform and educate more people around those types of things as well. Land tenure is a big issue that needs to be addressed. If we're really talking about trying to up the top end of Australia, the Northern Development Strategy that's happening with the Commonwealth, and a lot of large swathes of land, not only in the Kimberleys, but in the Northern Territory and also in Queensland, have native title over that. However, the native title doesn't actually give fungibility to traditional owners to actually use that land to develop economic opportunities. And how do we start to unlock that? And I think the importance of that is trying to build regional resilience around where we go through from there. So really wrapping up from there, I think we'll continue to say that another key issue would have been around regional staffing. We've seen a lot of external staff come into our region. I think we need to really start consolidating what are the opportunities for people within certain regions to do those specialist skills rather than bring outsiders in going from there. So that's it for me. Thanks for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tyronne. A lot more there to dig into afterwards as well. I'm conscious that Mark has limited time left, so I'm going to throw it right over to him now. There you go, Mark.
Thanks.
You're on.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina. And yeah, great to have everyone here after actually a really fantastic series of webinars here. Let me acknowledge the Ngunnawal country that I'm currently living on. I guess I just wanted to make two points at this stage. I think the first one has to do with opportunism, a necessary outback characteristic, and one which we need to think about pretty sharply right now, I think. And then the other is thinking about an agenda to take forwards, and in particular some stuff that the Outback Alliance has worked on, but whether that picks up the amazing richness of ideas that have come out, and which actually, COVID has managed to expose for us. So the first point then has to do with, I think, the reality, as we know, and you could see in some of Liz's maps, that the reality is that remote areas do have relatively small populations, and so we have to accept that we're never going to be the primary focus for policymakers all the time, that they quite legitimately and correctly have to spend most of their time thinking about places where most people live. Having said that, of course, we get periods when people are really concerned about remote areas, as we've just seen. And I think in general, it's done with good intentions. Occasionally we might argue otherwise, but usually people are wanting the best for for these remote areas. But the challenge is, because it is sporadic and rapid, usually what tends to happen is people come in, try and set something up very quickly, don't do proper consultation, don't engage with the locals to really understand their needs, and consequently impose a series of things which, as I say, may be well intended, but actually bring the mental models of areas that are more settled into all sorts of aspects of life, whether it's the way that we call for tenders for things, whether it's some of the things that Tyronne's just been talking about in terms of not really thinking through some of the financial aspects that you mentioned, or indeed the implications of moving youth back into an area and so on, all of which may be good things and probably well-intentioned, but actually haven't necessarily thought through how the remoter areas work and consequently whether that's going to disrupt things there. So because I think behind it there is usually good intentions, the key issue then becomes the policymakers are not suddenly going to start spending all their time thinking about remote areas. So the question is, how does one change structures enough that when they do have one of those sporadic attentions paid to the area, they've actually already got in place the consultation processes, or the people to talk to who do understand how the place operates, or the knowledge and understanding that can be drawn on to set up things like tender processes more effectively. And the issue is that because people aren't going to spend all their time worrying about this, one has to be very opportunistic about putting these things into place when attention is being paid. And this seems to be one of those opportunities right now, which we have to discuss whether we can capitalise on effectively. So to do that, I think one has to have at least 2 or 3 things in place. One is an opportunity where the attention is being focused on remote areas. A second is a good agenda to propose that might actually move those remote areas into a structure that enables these things to be done better in future. And thirdly, probably is reasonably good relations with the players who might implement that, who are probably going to be mostly based in capital cities. So the second point I want to make then is, if one is going to do that, you do need to try and have an agenda that's ready to go, as it were. And so I want to just highlight this, which is joining the dots, a set of policy ideas that the Outback Alliance has been thinking about for 2 or 3 years. I don't think they're perfect necessarily. And so it raises the question of, are there new things to think about which have been raised by this current circumstance that would make the proposals that are in there better? And I think, even just now I've heard a couple of interesting issues. For example, Liz mentioned the whole issue of it's all very well and fantastic for people to recognise that it's actually possible to do work from remote areas effectively. And so maybe actually there's a lot more opportunity for people to work in remote areas and live there and enjoy those lifestyle issues. But in order to do that, you have to have companies willing to, you might have seen on one of her slides, willing to set up regional functions that are effective, so that there are actually jobs for people to actually have a career path into, not just the sort of very bottom starter level, but where they could actually continue in a company in a regional centre. So there are structural things like that one can think about. So those sorts of things might be things that one would want to add to joining the dots. And I think I just want to finish by challenging us all to think about 2 questions then. One of them is this a time of opportunity to try and deliver some real concrete package of potential changes that the Commonwealth and state governments might actually be interested in listening to, because they've had this recent experience of the good things that Tyronne was talking about in terms of really engaging with and getting good solutions out of talking to people locally, whether they're Aboriginal leaders or we've heard others in the local government area in previous talks. So that's one question. Is this a good time? And if so, is what could be added to the agenda that joining the dots has that could create a really effective lobbying package there? And then secondly, what would be the steps then to actually make that try and happen? What would be the alliance of people across inland Australia that might speak with a bit of a single voice to try and achieve some of those changes that could enable things to be better in the long term? I think hopefully we can start a bit of that conversation now, but we have another session on Thursday afternoon in which we would really like to pick up these questions and engage with those of you who are interested to ask how we might take this forward. Thanks, Edwina.
Thank you. Okay, I've still got Liz and Tyronne on the line. Liz, I have a question first for you, and I know that you don't have the data yet in your big suite of data to back this up, but you know, I'm kind of curious as to whether, you know, your experience and your organisation's experience shows that regional areas are really likely to accelerate their growth much faster now in this sort of post-COVID world?
Yeah, good question. We've been spending a lot of time talking about this. It's certainly our ambition that that be the case, and we're doing everything that we can to ensure and support that movement. I guess in the data that I showed you, the report captured not only the last census, but the census period before. So we did actually get a 10-year trend that tells us that that movement to the regions is happening. And so if it had been happening in I guess the old world, as we think about the new world and what the new normal might be, the paradigm of work has just been, I guess, catapulted into a new regime and really catapulted into the future of work. So this notion of flexibility and working remotely, it's very real, and we've seen this firsthand with I've now got 12 corporates, some of big corporates such as Telstra, NBN, some of the banks, Expedia and the like, who have national and global footprints and are telling us that this is a trend that is going to continue to emerge. Interestingly, one of the greatest barriers to remote and flexible work in the past was actually at kind of mid-managerial levels. And you know, as much as people don't like to admit this, this is what's been coming through the surveys. And even those managers, if you talk to them, and I've spoken to many of them, they themselves have had that kind of bias tested. And so we think that if there are genuine employment opportunities and that we can create a truly national employment market, where location isn't a barrier, that absolutely that movement should continue. And equally, just to support that, maybe it's short term, but maybe it's longer term. All of the real estate platforms are also telling us that there's been a surge in real estate interest. Even so, to the point that I had an email yesterday from Kit Homes, of all things, the company telling me that they're being inundated with people looking to build regionally. So, you know, I think all things are pointing in the right direction.
Fantastic. Tyronne, that kind of leads into something you were talking about, which is, you know, I guess it's all well and good for us to kind of, you know, be sort of encouraging people out into the regions, but you know, we need to have the infrastructure there to sort of manage that influx of people. Tyronne, you did particularly mention that infrastructure, and I was kind of curious as to what, you know, were there any kind of high priority areas that your organisation had identified as really being sort of critical currently?
Look, I mean, really, some of the basic stuff are missing, and that's fundamentally just housing. And I dare say this, you know, the Kimberleys is no too different to a lot of other areas. You know, we have higher waiting list for Homes West housing, so state housing, and then it's further exacerbated with going out into those remote communities. But I think there's a strategy that needs to be looked at in regards to. I understand the financial position that both the state and Commonwealth finds itself in now, so I don't think that you know, we can go out and build a whole heap of new houses, but ensuring that there is some of the fundamentals like flushing water, you know, roof, you know, availability, you know, places to cook. So almost a tiered approach around infrastructure that needs to be looked at, and making sure that it's appropriate to the region, because quite often what we find is the houses that are being built in these remote locations aren't built for the purpose. So we've got plastered walls, larger bedrooms, and where generally what happens is that those people, those remote communities, spend not as much time in the houses. They spend a lot of them outside, outdoor kitchens. So even the planning around those need to be worked through. But the other opportunity really is about saying that how do you leverage the opportunity for smaller companies to try and tender for these types of contracts? Because what quite happens is you get the larger tier companies tendering, and they basically come in and do the body of work. And we've got a good example up in the Atlantic Peninsula where there's been a number of different contractors with all different housing designs. So what that creates is a nightmare for maintenance. All the different door sizes they have to try and go back and throw, all the different window sizes, different door locks, different. So I think there has to be more thought around how we manage that going forward if we are going to reinvest more infrastructure into these remote locations. How do we also think about the maintenance side of it as well?
Well, it sounds like some good feedback that you could pass on to Kit Homes there, Liz, on the property maintenance side.
Yeah, interesting, Tyronne.
So I was just curious of what organisations, this question's probably a good one for you, Liz, to start off with, but what organisations are best placed to advocate for investment in opportunities presented for remote and regional Australia currently? Who's best placed to kind of lead on this?
I mean, it's a good question. I think that the fact that the purpose of initiating our new council was to create a place where big business, corporate Australia, could actually make regional Australia a priority. That's essentially what they've signed up to. So, we've created a framework or agenda for that council, which looks at employment, jobs and employment, population, mobility, and livability, and of course then people leadership. So we're working our way through that agenda, and we're already getting very positive signs that these organisations are genuinely looking at not only providing employees and their staff with choice about where they live and continuing their careers, but also what are the different types of models to create regional hubs, regional rural remote hubs where that are multi-industry, and some of these already exist in some of our regional communities, and some of them have been initiated by government, some have been initiated by individuals. So it's really, it does go both ways. There is a role for community here to express interest, to show the initiative, as is often the way, as we see in regional, that says local champions, locally led initiatives that, if there's enough passion there to get this off the ground, someone will genuinely look to support that. But equally, I guess we see part of our role as bringing more corporates, more big business to the table to help support regional development and economic and social prosperity across the regions. So that's probably a starting point.
Yeah, okay. Tyronne, I have a question here for you. I guess this is actually one that I'm sort of curious on myself. I think it's such a day-by-day thing from sort of one area to the next, and it seems, from week to week that you wake up kind of in one sort of frame of mind, and it's just moving so quickly. And I guess I'm sort of interested in your community, Tyronne, about what the general mood is like now. Is there a sense of anxiety? We have this sort of almost two-phase thing where we're seeing half the country kind of opening, back up and coming back out again, when the other half is increasingly sort of having to lock down. And I was, interested in how that was sort of playing out in anxiety levels or the general mood in your community.
Yeah, look, generally the mood is, I think we've gone from one of anxiety from the Tri-8 region, started to roll out, and then we had a number of cases in Broome. and then another more cases in Halls Creek, and another one in a couple in Kununurra. So it sort of started to spread across the region. And then we basically realised, we found out through all the tracing, we found out where those cases were generally coming from, and we found out they were coming from really 3 different sources. Once we were able to isolate that, and now it's been nearly 3 months since we've last had a case in the Kimberleys, the anxiety levels have started to drop. But I think the concern really going forward is, and what's played a role in that, is that the communities still have a level of protection around the remote communities direction number 3. So that's the state bit of legislation on the State Emergency Act that enables communities to lock out anybody that isn't a full-time resident. You know, so it's up to a $50,000 fine if they go in there. So there's a little bit of an assurance policy there for those communities. I feel that they still have some leverage to try and protect those vulnerable people that may be in the community. But on the same token, they're starting to get a little bit of complacency. You know, we were starting to have 3 months now. All the borders within Western Australia starting to open up. The waves of tourists are coming up into Broome. You know, it's most probably peak tourism time. So people are wanting to get out, go out to places like the Bundles, the Gibb River Road, and get access to all those areas. So I think it's a little bit of a balance, you know, and I think there's been a lot of work done by WA Health and also the Aboriginal Medical Services around scenario planning. So if there are breakouts, how do we quickly quarantine those areas? How do we make sure that we provide adequate services in an effective time? And I think we've also worked very closely with each of those communities around their pandemic plans. So I think we've had enough time now to sort of take stock of where we are and put some measures in place to try and reduce a lot of that anxiety. I mean, I don't think we'll ever get anything 100% right, but at least there's a process now, whereas prior at the start of this, there was basically decisions being made pretty much uninformed because it was new to everybody, and they were making it at such a rapid rate. And the confusion and the lack of communication added to that anxiety.
Fantastic. All right, look, I'm conscious that we're just nearly at time now, so I'm going to wrap up, but I just wanted to throw open to all 3 of you before we do go with any sort of parting thoughts, and you know, that might be something that's really stood out for you as a positive from this period of time, and something that you'd like to sort of carry forward, or just a sort of standout message or pointer to end with. So Mark, I'm going to throw over to you. I know you'll be joining us on Thursday to dig more in depth into this, but if you'd like to give us any parting wisdom before you go.
Yeah, I'd actually just like to pick up 2 points that have been made very briefly. I mean, one of them, the question of what organisations are best placed to advocate. I think this is a really important question, and it's incredibly fantastic that RAI are establishing the private sector side. But there has to be, I think, a flip side to that, which is community structures or structures which are embedded in the regions. And I don't think we should, you know, there are things around. It's a matter of just going a step further in terms of legitimising them. So there's things like the Rangelands Alliance of NRM groups, which is national, basically, a national outback. That can pick up that aspect of an agenda. There are local government alliances which could be structured a little bit better, and the sort of regional development things. There's obviously Indigenous groups that talk across the region too. I think if we took that step of trying to structure that just a little bit more consistently, that would really help. And that couples to the second comment, which is just, I've seen a couple of comments come in around sort of whether the housing design is appropriate and whether they're consulting with people out there. And you mentioned, Tyronne, the idea of people may go and build it but not think about the maintenance side. This really speaks to structuring again and insisting on the ability to have local expression of demand, if you like, to be able to articulate that and say what's needed, and to bring the experiences of those sorts of things, to recognise that you might be able to pop out to Bunnings and pick up any of 10 different door handles if you're in a city, but actually you can't do that if you're in a remote community, so you need some consistency in that, things like that. So I would just say, coming out of this, that really thinking about how we create that bottom-up element to match in with, if you like, some more top-down things is really important at this time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Liz, any final parting thoughts?
Oh, look, I mean, yeah, it's been really fascinating discussion. So just thank you to all of the panelists. I was really heartened by a number of the positives that you captured in your presentation, Tyronne, in particular the reduction or zeroing out of crime. Fascinating. And just, yeah, that the issues around domestic violence, I mean, that's just incredible, because in other parts of, I guess, broader Australia, we saw an increase in domestic violence. So there's something really interesting in that, about that connection with country and getting back to family and community and culture and heritage. So I was really heartened by that, and yeah, would love to explore that a little bit more. I guess the other piece that I think is interesting and doesn't surprise me is the issue of housing and infrastructure. We at the Institute have done a lot of work in migration, regional migration, particularly in smaller rural and remote communities. And one of the biggest issues is housing. So I'm not surprised that there's massive underinvestment in some of our Indigenous communities, and that's something that needs to be addressed. I have raised this housing issue also with the council, the corporate council, as well as government. So I think there's something here that we probably should continue to explore collectively as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. And Tyronne, any parting thoughts from you today?
Look, I think really a lot of the lessons learned and come from today is to say that collaboration and some of the stuff that Mark's touching on is really at the heart of how do we start to really address some of these issues and start to address some of these issues that we're now having to face with. So, I mean, how do you maintain that level of consultation post the pandemic? And that's what we're starting to see, is that even now, as some of the easing of the restrictions of some of those relationships and networks that we were previously working alongside during the pandemic has sort of subsided a bit. And so how do we keep that momentum going forward, I think is something that we need to really reflect on and try and maintain.
Fantastic, thank you. That was really, really good session, and I feel like, you know, the further we go down this road, the more these kind of common themes are coming out, and certainly some of the positives, Tyronne, that you particularly talked to, and Liz as well, and yours, have been themes that have come up through various sessions. So certainly in our last talk on Thursday, and kind of moving forward as we sort of go forward and kind of shape outcomes from these sessions, we'll be, you know, really kind of focusing in on those. So I would like to thank all three of you for joining us today and sharing your wise insights, and to all of the attendees as well for coming along too. So thank you very much, and please join us again on Thursday for the last session.